Scholastic Audio presents Infinity Ring, Book 4, Curse of the Ancients, by Matt de la Peña, read by Dion Graham. Prologue. Every other time Sera has warped through history with Dak and Rick, it's happened in an instant. She gets sucked into a void, her stomach climbing up into her throat, her whole body shifting into floating particles, no longer a solid thing. It's beyond any roller coaster freefall imaginable. And then, just before she gets sick, she opens her eyes in another time and place. But this warp is not like the others. Instead of time speeding up, it slows down. And a wall lifts inside her mind. She sees herself hurrying through flooding streets, out of breath, underneath a blistering twilight sky. Thick tornadoes ripping through neighborhoods in the distance. The blood-red sun hovering closer to Earth than seems possible, electrical surges shooting out from its core, making the swirling wind intolerably hot and sticky. Acid rain gushing down in slanted sheets. People leaning out of upper-story windows, all of them wide-eyed and screaming, holding one another. But Sera can't afford to stop and help. She has to keep moving, has to get where she's going before it's too late. She is alone now, but she didn't come here alone. Ilsa was with her. Ilsa, her enemy. Sera left her behind where she had collapsed, left her with a promise to return, a promise to get them both to safety. But not yet. Sera has something to do first. The water rushing through the streets rises quickly until it's nearly head-high, and Sera is forced to scale a fire escape where she shoves up against a wall, sucking in breaths and looking all around her. The world is ending, right before her eyes. She spots a small motorized emergency raft tied to a looted fire truck. No one inside. She launches herself toward it, splashing into the water and swimming frantically. She hacks the rope in half with a switchblade, climbs in, and hotwires the engine. In seconds, she's speeding through intersection after intersection, steering herself around all the bodies floating face down in the water. Some are children, some old people. She moves past men who squat alone on overturned cars, expressionless as zombies. One man turns and looks Sera dead in the face as she veers around him, sending a chill down her spine, because in his lifeless eyes, she sees the truth of the cataclysm. It's not only the disintegration of the world, but the world's people, too. That's when Sera realizes she's screaming. She's screaming and crying and gunning the raft, shouting at anyone within earshot, "Somebody help us! This can't be happening!" But it is. All around her, there are military trucks on their sides, and old, stubborn trees split down the middle and charred black. People flushed from their homes by the surging floods. Gaps are opening up in the earth's crust, splitting roads in half, swallowing entire buildings, clusters of people reaching out for help, calling the names of loved ones who are no longer alive. Sera zips past all of it, turning onto her childhood street. She lets off the gas as she nears her house, then dives overboard and swim-walks her way up the flooded driveway, fearing the unspeakable horrors she's afraid she'll find inside. What will she find inside? What will she find? Just as she reaches a trembling hand out for the doorknob, though, the memory slips away. Chapter 1. Storm Warnings. Sera opened her eyes, shaking. She was kneeling in clay-colored dirt, completely out of breath, and clutching the infinity ring to her chest. The first thing she saw when she looked up was a short, dark-skinned woman dressed in a tunic like quipul, holding a baby in each arm, hurrying past what looked to be some kind of ancient temple. A boy and a girl, both younger than Sera, ran by next, followed by a man wearing an elaborate headdress. Sera turned to Dak and Rick. They were watching the same thing, dozens of people rushing past them, trying to get away from something. But what? Sera's heart still pounded inside her chest. These trips through time were typically hard enough on her body, but this one had been different. It seemed to have shaken loose part of her repressed memory of the cataclysm. During a previous mission, she'd taken an accidental trip to the future, which had given her a glimpse of the end of the world. When Sera came back, though, she was so traumatized by the experience she could only remember a few details, as if unconsciously protecting herself from what she knew she couldn't handle. So, technically, it hadn't been a lie when she told Dak and Rick she had nothing of interest to tell them about her warp without them. Now that she remembered reaching for her door, though, she was desperate to recall what she had found inside her house. Why couldn't she remember? Sera shook the cataclysm from her mind for now and forced herself to take in her surroundings. The three of them were partially hidden behind a row of trees. The sky was full of clouds. The air smelled clean, the way it sometimes did just before rain. "Dude, why are you crying?" She turned and found Dak staring at her. "I'm not crying," she said, straightening her posture. "Why would I be crying?" I don't know," he said. "That's kind of why I asked." Sera dismissed him with the wave of a hand and stood up, reaching for her face on the sly. Sure enough, warm tears met the tips of her fingers. "I'm definitely not crying," she snapped at her supposed best friend. "Maybe the time travel's just getting harder on our bodies. Did you ever think about that, Dak?" "It's definitely getting harder on mine," Rick said. He gave Sera a subtle nod that meant he had her back. Dak stood up too. "What time period are we in, anyway? There are supposed to be Spanish conquistadors all over this place, right? And Franciscan monks? The Yucatan was crawling with those guys in 1562. All I see are scared-looking Mayas." Sera studied the people hurrying past the temple across from them. It was true. They were all Mayan. She looked down at the infinity ring. They were supposed to have landed in 1562. She was sure she'd programmed in the right coordinates. "Who has the square?" Rick asked. Sera handed it to him, saying, "According to the display, we're in Itzamal. I don't understand what I could have done wrong." She watched Rick study the screen, then step out from behind the trees to stop a passing boy. "Friend, please hold on for a second," he said in a foreign popping tongue that Sera's translation device had momentary trouble rendering into English. "Where is everyone going?" The boy slowed. After looking the three time travelers up and down, he shouted, "The great storm is coming! Everyone must find shelter right away!" The boy turned and hurried off. Sera looked up, along with Dak and Rick. The sky was full of gray clouds, sure, but it didn't look like anything out of the ordinary. Definitely not a great storm. Then again, according to what she'd learned in school, the Maya were incredibly superstitious. Maybe something had gone wrong at one of their ceremonies. Dak must have been thinking the same thing because he kept shaking his head. "Funny, I thought we would be the ones running for our lives." He turned to Rick and Sera, clearly readying himself for one of his infamous historical rants. "You do know that the Maya are considered a violent and hedonistic civilization, right? They sacrificed people, and they were always at war, and they ate the hearts of their own dead family members." "Never read about any heart eating," Rick said. "Okay, maybe not that last part, but that's enough, Dak," Sera said. "What? Their big contribution to the world was that they wrote the great Mayan Codex, and it's only considered great because it warned us of the curse, how our world is heading toward a massive cataclysm, and that our only hope was a group that would one day come along known as the SQ," Rick interrupted. "We've all read the same history books, Dak." Sera cringed at the mention of the cataclysm. She pictured herself reaching for the door of her house again. And then, nothing. "Concentrate on the here and now," she told herself, taking the square back from Rick and rechecking their last series of instructions. They seemed straightforward enough. "Help the Maya, 1562. Then a series of coordinates for the ring. Dak tapped Sera on the arm and motioned toward Rick. "I liked it better when we hated this guy." "We never hated him," Sera said. "Speak for yourself." "Believe me," Rick said. "The feeling was mutual." "Maybe we should turn back the clock," Dak said. He elbowed Sera and gave her a big, goofy smile. "Get it? Turn back the clock?" He pointed at the infinity ring, tucked safely back inside the satchel hanging from her belt. "You truly are a child," Rick said. "And you're a clown." "Stop," Sera said. "Please, I need to think. If there are no conquistadors, like Dak said, maybe we really are in the wrong time, because we're definitely in the correct geographical area. You really don't think we're in 1562? Rick said. I don't. Sera looked back down at the square. There had to be some scientific explanation for this. Science had never failed her before. There's no way we're in 1562, Dak said. All you have to do is look at that temple across the way. If it was 1562, it would have already been turned into a church. The first thing the Franciscans did when they arrived from Spain was modify the major temples into churches. They wanted to teach the locals there were other ways to live. I can't believe you guys don't know that. Easy, Dak, Sera said. I'm not feeling real patient right now. Just then, the sky exploded in thunder directly above them. A light rain began to fall. Sera looked up, shielding her eyes with her free hand. The clouds seemed darker now, and the wind was beginning to stir. The Mayas continued hurrying past them along the sparkling white road into the distance. "Take shelter!" a man shouted. "The great storm is coming!" What great storm? Sera thought. And what did these people know about predicting the weather anyway? Back home, meteorologists only got it right about a third of the time, and they had the most up-to-date equipment known to man. Come on, Rick said. Let's go find a place out of the rain, and we have to do something about these Japanese clothes. It was fun being a samurai while it lasted, Dak said sadly. As they stepped out from behind the trees and started across the raised white road, Dak poked Sera in the shoulder. It really did look like you were crying. Was it because the ring took us to the wrong time? Sera shook her head and focused her eyes in front of her. She was done thinking about the cataclysm. They had too much work to do. Did you have one of those remnant things? I wasn't crying, Dak, Sera snapped. Just leave it alone already. Jeez, Dak said. Bite my head off. Maybe I just wanted to make sure you were okay. The sky lit up with lightning, followed by the crashing sound of more thunder. All three of them cowered as they ran. Sera followed Dak and Rick behind a short row of stone huts, her mind slipping back to the horrible details of what she'd seen and heard of the cataclysm. The sounds of screams over a chorus of never-ending sirens, the earth's violent shifting under her feet every few minutes. They had to fix the rest of the brakes, or else. And warping to the wrong time wasn't exactly a promising start. Chapter 2. Fashionably early. When Dak saw Sera emerge from behind the sculpture-covered stone wall, he had to cover his mouth with a fist to stifle a laugh. What? Sera said. Nothing, Dak told her, launching into a fit of fake coughing. She was dressed in a crazy-looking sack with a hole cut out for her head, as well as a long, colorful skirt that dragged in the dirt behind her when she walked. But the weirdest part was how closely she resembled one of them, the Mayas. Same skin color and high cheekbones, same coarse, dark hair. If Sera wanted, she could probably pass for a local. Now was not the time to bring it up, of course. They just downloaded a seemingly impossible riddle on the square, and Dak had been best friends with Sera long enough to know when not to mess with her. Go on, Dak, Sera said. I promise, he told her. It's nothing. Say it, she demanded. The look on her face told him she wasn't going to drop it. Okay, fine, he said. I was just thinking about, how nice of an outfit that is. Like your loincloth is any better? Sera said, pointing below his waist. It's not a loincloth, Dak said, instinctively covering himself. It's a breechcloth. He looked down at the clothes Rick had swiped for him off of a tree near a cluster of empty huts. And maybe your vision's been compromised from all that crying you were doing back there, but I'm also clearly wearing pants, more like leggings, Sera said. Dak turned to Rick for help. He was wearing the exact same outfit, but Rick was too busy peeking out from under the overhang that was keeping them out of the rain, watching the Mayas continuing to hurry past. Dak sighed. Sometimes it got lonely trying to rescue history all by himself. Can I see the riddle one more time? Rick asked, turning back to the others. Sera handed over the square, and the three of them studied the nonsensical words for the 10th time. A snake charmer and a clown, a treasure that never was, a gift from the deity Itzamna, from 9.10.5.10.7 to 11.17.2.13.10. Trace the symbol of the ceiba tree toward the truth of the curse. Dak threw his hands in the air. Impossible! He didn't have the first idea how to approach it. And usually, he was pretty good at working through the cryptic clues the historians had left so they'd know which break to fix. "We have to make a decision," Rick said, looking up at Dak and Sera. "We either search for a better place to wait out this rain, or we ignore it and concentrate on solving the riddle." "It's not even a question," Sera said. "We have to figure out where we should be and what we should be doing." "You think you can do it in these conditions?" Rick asked. "I know I can. We've cracked number ciphers before." "Then let's get to work." Guys?" Dak said. "Excuse me." When they'd both turned to face him, he said, "Don't you think I should maybe have some say in this, too?" "What is it, Dak?" Sera asked. "Well, it's been a while since we've eaten, right? I mean, technically it's been several hundred years." Sera rolled her eyes. "And your point is?" Dak motioned to Rick. "What do you say we send this guy off to find us a nice cheese plate? I'm thinking Gruyere and cheddar. Maybe a few figs and grapes on the side. Oh, and saltines." Sera's mouth fell open. "Are you kidding me right now, Dak?" "Fine, nix the saltines," Dak said. "I get it. You're in the mood for something a bit classier. Let's go ahead and spring for Triscuits, then." "An absolute child," Rick said, shaking his head. Sera and Rick both turned away from Dak and began tinkering with the square. "Seriously, though," Dak called to them. "Aren't you guys hungry?" They ignored him. Dak watched them work for a few minutes. Sera obviously knew what she was doing. She was a genius when it came to science, so working with numbers came somewhat naturally to her. And as a language whiz, Rick had an advantage over Dak whenever their clues involved codes or ciphers. Knowing that didn't make it any easier to be benched, though. "Whatever," Dak muttered under his breath. He wandered a few yards down the stone wall and sat against it, watching the rain and thinking about the riddle. A snake charmer, a clown, a treasure that never was, the truth of the curse. None of it rang any bells. Being left alone like this reminded Dak of what got them into this history-saving situation in the first place. Just a few days ago. Wait, how was he supposed to measure days while traveling through time? He couldn't exactly consult a modern calendar, and the Mayan version wouldn't do him any good. However long ago it was, the last time they were back home, in the present, he'd mistakenly let Sera into his parents' lab, where she had become obsessed with the infinity ring, ignoring him for hours and hours and hours, just like she was ignoring him now. Dak shook his head, thinking about that fateful day. If he'd never shown her what his parents were working on, Sera never would have figured out the missing piece of the puzzle. And if she hadn't figured out the missing piece of the puzzle, they never would have taken that stupid test run back to the Revolutionary War, and his parents wouldn't be lost somewhere in time right now. Dak watched several more Mayas race down the white street, carrying their children in their arms. It was a strange sight, considering the rain was hardly more than a lazy drizzle, though the wind was definitely picking up now. Dak leaned his head back against the wall, fingering the iron key he had tucked into the side of his leggings. His parents had given it to him in the year 911, somehow knowing that he would need it to escape the SQ in 1850. It boggled his mind. Dak squeezed his eyes shut, tightened his grip on the key, and imagined their faces. He understood that what he, Sera, and Rick were doing was monumentally important. They were literally trying to save the world. And he loved warping back to different parts of history, seeing famous events unfold right before his eyes. But lately, in secret, Dak wondered if he wouldn't ditch all the heroics in exchange for having his mom and dad back in his life, even for a day. These thoughts made Dak feel guilty, so he got up and hustled back over to Sera and Rick, saying, "Never fear, my fellow time-traveling comrades. I've come to save the day. Please, how might my talents best be utilized?" They didn't even acknowledge his existence. "Guys?" Nothing. Dak shrugged. If they didn't need him, he didn't need them either. He turned to go and explore the wet Mayan village on his own. If he was lucky, he'd find some vital clue to the riddle, which he wouldn't share with anyone. Dak found himself crossing back over the white road toward a large domed building a little ways off. It looked like an observatory. He cupped a hand against his forehead to keep the rain out of his eyes. It was so hot and humid he was almost thankful to be wearing a breechcloth. It was actually keeping him fairly cool and allowed for occasional drafts that proved tremendously refreshing. What if he started rocking one of these bad boys in the present? Would it catch on? He pictured all his bros in 5th grade wearing them too, sitting around the calf, talking, lining up for assemblies. Eventually they'd run a nice profile piece on him in the school paper next to the caption, "Dak Smith, more than your ordinary history genius." Then he remembered one very important fact. He didn't really have any bros. Unless he counted Sera, which he decided he did. Dak tried all the doors of the observatory, but they were locked. He was surprised by the size of the building. According to his research on Mesoamerican civilizations, the Maya were curious about astrology and art and music, but they didn't have the technology for anything overly refined. For instance, they probably weren't spreading their cheese onto Triscuits. Thunder crashed so loud overhead, Dak flinched. The rain started falling harder too, and at an odd angle. Dak knew he should hurry back to the others, get out of the brewing storm, but just then he spotted a narrow opening in the observatory wall, like a small glassless window. He moved toward it and peered inside, the rain raking down his back. It was dark inside, except for a few candles that burned near the far wall of the large room. Next to this wall, which had a large painting of a tree, were 3 older men kneeling on the floor, writing on a massive sheet of paper-like material. The thing was longer than they were tall. Then, on the floor beside them, Dak spotted something else. A colorful mask, the kind a clown might wear. Dak immediately thought of the riddle. Maybe there was some kind of connection. And then Dak considered something else, something potentially incredible. What if these men were working on the great Mayan Codex? He knew there were probably many codices, a type of book, produced during this era, but his heart sped up anyway, because everything around him made him think he was in the 7th century, and that meant it was possible that he was witnessing the composition of one of the most revered texts in all of history. Dak pounded on the wall, so excited he was having trouble breathing. As soon as the men looked up, though, he thought better of it and ducked out of sight. Because if the authors of the Great Mayan Codex had prophesied that the SQ would one day come along and save all mankind, it was possible that the authors themselves were SQ, or even a group of time wardens whom the SQ had positioned throughout history to protect their agenda from meddling time travelers, like Dak. He crouched there for several long minutes, trying to think. Rain pummeled his entire body, puddling around his knees and elbows. He finally pushed away from the observatory and sprinted back across the road. He had to go tell Rick and Sera about the clown mask and the Codex, even if they didn't deserve to know. When Dak finally rounded the stone wall and spotted his friends, he stopped in his tracks. "No," he said under his breath. Rick and Sera were surrounded by 3 thuggish-looking Mayas, one of whom was holding the infinity ring in his grimy hands. Chapter 3. Storm Relief. The rain was pounding down so hard against the thin metallic overhang, Rick was having trouble hearing the man standing directly in front of him. "I'm sorry, Ichik," he interrupted. "How far did you say your home is from here?" As the man was answering, Rick caught a small blur racing toward them out of the corner of his eye. He turned to get a better look and mumbled under his breath, "Dak?" "Nobody messes with my friends!" Dak shouted, just before launching himself at the man holding the infinity ring. They both fell to the ground, and the ring went flying through the air. Rick instinctively dove out into the rain to try to catch it, but the ring landed just beyond his reach with a thud. "The ring!" Sera screamed. Rick quickly scooped it up and looked it over. It was slightly dented on one side and muddy. The screen was blank. He watched Sera position herself between Dak and the man he'd just attacked. "What in the name of mincemeat do you think you're doing?" she asked. "Protecting you guys," Dak said. "Protecting us? From what?" "These Mayan time wardens." Dak pointed at the three men. Sera slapped a hand against her forehead. Rick ducked back under the overhang, dripping wet. "They came out here to help us, not hurt us," he shouted at Dak over the storm. "Itchik here was just offering to lead us to shelter." "And how do you know it's not a trap?" Dak shouted back. Itchik turned to Rick with a look of confusion. "What does the small boy mean, a trap?" Rick sighed. "Honestly, it's best if you just ignore the small boy," he said. Violent thunder echoed through the entire village. "The storm!" one of the other Mayan men shouted over the increasing winds. "It is nearing the village! We must go inside immediately!" "Please," Itchik said. "Come with us." Rick handed the ring back to Sera, who looked it over. "Well, let's hope it still works," she said, slipping it back into her satchel. Rick and Sera were both staring at Dak. "What?" he said. The noise of the storm made it impossible to communicate. Everyone kept quiet as the Mayas led Rick, Sera, and Dak through the bustling village. Many people seemed to be headed in the opposite direction, which worried Rick. Maybe they were following the wrong men. But when they stopped in front of an especially large stone hut, he saw other groups of Mayan families hunkering down in neighboring huts too. Itchik and his men quickly unlatched the front door and stepped inside, motioning for Rick and the others to enter. "But we're sopping wet," Rick said, indicating his dripping, muddy clothes and the puddles forming around his feet. "This does not matter," Itchik said. "Please, you must join us inside." As they wrung out their clothes by the door, Rick peered around the inside of the hut. He trusted Itchik and his friends, but he also couldn't shake the memory of what had happened in 1850 when SQ slave traders had masqueraded as historian allies. His eyes went immediately to a cluster of Mayas huddled together in the middle of the room, singing. Based on the lyrics, Rick gathered that their song was directed at some type of rain god. He studied their faces, which showed both fear and awe for the storm. A girl around his age suddenly turned and met his eyes. She was still singing with everyone else, but he noticed a slight raise at the corners of her mouth. This subtle smile made him feel that he was safe inside the hut, but it also made him feel something else, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The girl turned back to the group just as Dak whispered, "Guys, listen to me. I don't think they're time wardens." Sera patted him on the back. "Whatever gives you that idea, Dak? Is it because that's what we just told you outside? Or is it the fact that they basically rescued us from a tropical storm and brought us into their home?" Rick added. Dak frowned at Rick and turned back to Sera. "Look, I'm sorry I damaged the ring, okay? But I saw these guys huddled around you, and one of them was holding the ring, and I just sort of freaked." Sera sighed. "Don't worry, we'll fix it," she said. "I'll fix it." "At least I figured out what time we're in," Dak said. "Approximately. We're definitely in the 7th century, not 1562. We were off by less than a millennium." "That part is my fault," Sera whispered. "Although I'm not sure what I did wrong." "I'm still not convinced landing here was a mistake," Rick replied. "Maybe there's something important happening here, too. Like, what if this storm is somehow connected to the riddle?" Oh! Dak was suddenly so excited he was jumping up and down. "I meant to tell you guys, I saw something important inside the observatory. You won't believe this. Seriously." "Go on," Sera said. "Spit it out." But before Dak could say another word, Itchik clapped his hands together and called to them. "Friends, please join us in our small ceremony. We are asking the gods not to wash away our crops, and for a safe passage here for our neighbors from Kalakmul, who are to come and study our discoveries." Rick motioned for Sera and Dak to follow him toward the middle of the room. As they walked, Dak said softly, "I'll tell you guys about the observatory later. It could be part of the riddle, though. Also, I have a new theory about these people. I think they might be historians." "They're not historians," Rick said, turning around. How do you know? We sort of asked them already, Sera said. Indirectly, of course. Dak shook his head. No, I definitely think they're historians. Why else would they be so much nicer than the history books portray them? Rick tuned out of the rest of Dak and Sera's whispered conversation. He was too busy testing a theory of his own. He stared at the Mayan girl who had smiled at him, willing her to turn and look at him one more time. He needed to see how he reacted. It took a few seconds, but she finally did turn to him, still singing, and looked directly into his eyes. And she gave him another smile, too. A real one this time. Rick's suspicions were confirmed. The second their eyes locked, that strange feeling returned to his stomach. It was almost like a remnant, but better somehow. A good kind of queasiness. What did it mean? Whatever the answer, it was unlike anything Rick had ever felt before. Chapter 4. The Wrath of Chak. While everyone else was chanting to the Mayan rain deity, Chak, Sera was quietly experiencing the most profound remnant of her entire life. Her stomach was twisted in knots. She clenched her teeth and cringed at the familiar iron taste flooding her mouth. She felt so dizzy she had to plant both hands firmly on the dirt floor next to where she sat. Dak and Rick were totally unaware. They'd just been taught the simple refrain and had joined the Mayas in their chanting. The man who called himself Itchik was the only one who seemed to notice Sera's distress. Thankfully, he wasn't calling attention to it. Sera was all too familiar with remnants, the feeling that something was missing, that if history had unfolded in a slightly different way, she'd be living her real life instead of this shadow version. Back home, she'd often walk past her barn and suddenly be overwhelmed by the sense that her parents, who she'd never known, were inside, tending to a trio of beautiful thoroughbreds. But when she pulled open the door, she'd find the barn completely empty. Her remnants had grown stronger since they started traveling through time, but this was by far the most powerful one she had experienced. She took deep, even breaths, wondering why now, during a storm, surrounded by Mayas. When the remnant finally passed, Sera let out a relieved sigh and resumed half-heartedly mouthing the chant with everyone else. She noted how intensely the storm was hammering down on the roof above them, the sound echoing throughout the cavernous hut. She studied the worried look on all the faces around her. The storm was much more severe than she had thought it would be, though it was nothing compared to what she remembered of the cataclysm. After a few more minutes, Itchik raised a hand, and the chanting ceased. "Young visitors from a faraway place," he said. "I would like to welcome you to our village and introduce you to my people." He proceeded to rattle off several Mayan names that Sera knew she'd never remember, especially on the heels of such a powerful remnant. There were 3 separate Mayan families, each with several children. There were a few stooped elders, too. The only name that stuck in Sera's head was Kisa, the girl who was a few years older than Sera and very pretty. Itchik turned to his people and said, "And this is Rick, Sera, and... I'm sorry, I don't believe I ever learned the name of the smaller boy." "I'm not that small," Dak fired back. "It's a pleasure meeting everyone," Rick blurted out. Sera leaned over to Dak and whispered, "Try to keep in mind that if it wasn't for them, we'd be out there getting pummeled by this storm." Dak turned to Itchik. "The name's Dak Smith, Sir Dude." "Very good," Itchik said. "My family and I would like to welcome all of you to our home." "Welcome," everyone else said together. One of the women unpacked a small stack of asymmetrical tortilla-looking things and passed them out to everyone. Sera didn't realize how hungry she was until she started eating the corn-based bread. Minutes later, there was a loud crashing sound on the roof, and everyone looked up. "What was that?" the girl named Kisa said. "The storm still grows," one of the elders explained. "Trees are now blowing over." 2 small girls began to cry quietly and ducked under the arms of their mother. "Don't be scared," the elder said. "Chak is looking over us." Itchik turned to Sera Dak and Rick, and said, "From where have you traveled, friends? You certainly don't look like our neighbors to the north or south." He paused for a second and pointed at Sera. "With the exception of the girl." "I'm definitely not your neighbor," she snapped. Rick shot her a look. Sera shrugged. Even Rick would have to admit that associating her with the Mayan didn't make sense. And back in second grade, during a lesson on lost civilizations, stupid Sylvia Walker had drawn a stick figure of a girl sitting on top of a Mayan temple next to the caption, "Sarah's great-great-great-grandmother." The kids all laughed and asked if her mom packed a thermos full of goat blood in her lunch. There was a reason Sera was so sensitive. "Where are we from?" Dak echoed. He had a big grin on his face, which told Sera she should be extremely worried. "That's an interesting question, Itchy." "Itchik," Rick corrected. Dak winked at Sera and Rick and turned back to the Mayan man. "We come from a place far, far away. I believe you know what I'm saying." "The remote highlands?" Itchik asked. "Dak," Sera said, shooting him a dirty look. "We've already discussed this. Let me put it another way," Dak said, ignoring her. "You know your fancy calendar?" "Ah, one of the great achievements of our ancestors," Itchik said. "Yeah, well, we've just about made it to the end of that bad boy." Sera looked at Rick, who let his head fall into his hands. Itchik was staring at Dak, a confused look on his face. "Where do we come from?" Dak said. "Let's just say it's a place where people consider these things a little outdated." He pointed down at his breechcloth. "Seriously, Dak?" Sera tried again. "Drop it, please." Dak couldn't seem to get it through his thick head that not everyone they met was going to be a historian or time warden. Dak only grinned at Sera and turned back to Itchik. "I'm talking about the future, Itchy, where people drive cars and fly planes and eat tortillas that are actually symmetrical, filled with grated cheese. I'm talking about quesadillas, my friend." Sera rolled her eyes. She glanced at Rick, who threw his hands in the air. "I don't understand what your friend is saying," Itchik said, turning to them. "Neither does he," Sera answered. "Please, just ignore. Do I really have to spell this thing out for everybody?" Dak interrupted. "You guys are historians, and we've traveled here from the future. Go on, Sera. Show him the infinity ring again and explain how it works. Rick, pull the riddle up on the square. I can't believe I have to broker this whole thing myself." "What's a historian?" Kisa asked. Everyone was staring at Dak, completely baffled, including Sera and Rick. Even the smallest Mayan baby was staring at him. The grin on Dak's face slowly fell away, and he turned to Sera. "Wait, is it possible that they're not actually historians?" Before Sera could answer, there was a second tremendous crashing sound from up above. Sera looked up and saw that the wooden slats were actually being pulled from the roof and carried away in the powerful winds. Rain started streaming down into the hut, scattering everyone. The children screamed, and their parents covered their small heads and hurried them to the far wall, away from the widening hole. Sera, Dak, and Rick ran to the opposite corner. "The storm is too vicious," Rick shouted. "The entire roof will come down." Sera looked up. She saw more wood being torn away. Uneven chunks of rock came crashing down into the hut. "We can't stay here," she shouted. But when she tried to get up, Rick held her by the wrist. "We need to stick together," he shouted. There was so much commotion inside the disintegrating hut, Sera couldn't think. Rain poured down all around them. The wind howled. Children wailed. A thick tree branch fell from above, slamming into the earth only inches in front of Sera's face. "Watch out!" Dak suddenly shouted. Sera thought he was shouting at her, but when she looked up, she saw a little Mayan girl standing alone near the front door of the hut, crying as that part of the wall started caving in. Before Sera could even think to move, Dak sprang to his feet and raced toward the girl. He shoved her out of harm's way toward her mom, just as the wall collapsed, cracking him in the back of the head and driving him into the ground. "Dak!" Sera screamed. She sprinted over to him, slid down to her knees, and lifted his face. He was trapped under the rubble of the stone wall, and his eyes were huge with fear. There was already blood caked in his hair, running in slick lines down his neck and shoulders. "Dak!" she shouted again. "Dak, please! Can you hear me?" "The observatory," he mumbled. "What?" "The people writing inside," he said, blinking his eyes and swallowing. "See them? It could be part of the riddle." "I don't understand what you're saying," Sera pleaded. Rick was beside them now, too. "Stay with me, Dak," Sera shouted. "Just stay with me." But Dak's eyes slowly rolled into the back of his head. He lost consciousness. Chapter 5. A Sleepless Night. Rick strained to keep a tight grip under both of Dak's arms as he helped carry him through the surging storm. Itchik and another man at his feet. He watched Sera hurrying alongside them, holding a blanket over Dak's face so he wouldn't drown in the falling rain. "Dak!" she kept shouting. "Can you hear me, Dak? It's Sera. Please look at me, Dak." But Dak wasn't looking at anyone. He was out cold. Rick had never seen anyone take such a nasty blow in his life. As they moved past the temple, a sudden gust of wind knocked them all over into the mud. Rick and the two Mayan men scrambled to their feet, quickly lifting Dak back up and continuing away from the village toward the hills on the outskirts of town. The women, children, and elders from the hut were several paces ahead already, holding on to one another, leaning into the teeth of the storm. Rick winced as he slowly moved through the mud with Dak. His leg was killing him. He'd been struck in the knee by a falling board when the roof of the hut had collapsed. He wasn't sure how much longer he could go on, but every time he thought of asking for a rest, he would picture Dak pushing that little girl out of the way, taking the brunt of the wall's impact on his own head and back. He'd saved her life. Remembering this fact always gave Rick the shot of adrenaline he needed to fight through the pain and fatigue. They carried Dak uphill over fallen trees, through knee-high puddles of rain, and across long stretches of quicksand-like mud. Eventually, they approached the mouth of a large cave where several Mayan warriors were perched on large boulders, watching the storm. Itchik shouted at the men, "Get Jasaw immediately! We must help this boy!" Two of the warriors darted inside the cave. The rest leaped down from the boulders into the rain and helped carry Dak's limp body up to the cave's broad opening. Rick was relieved of his grip on Dak once they got inside. He watched Itchik and the others carry Dak across the dimly lit cave, Sera trailing closely behind. It took Rick's eyes a few seconds to adjust to the dull candlelight, but once he could see, he was taken aback. Several hundred Mayas were spread out on blankets across the uneven floor of the cave. Some were sleeping. Others were sitting together in small groups, chanting. A few turned to look him over. A man wearing a headdress pointed the men carrying Dak toward a large hanging blanket set up like a screen for privacy. Rick knew this must be the man Itchik had referred to as Jasaw, and he hurried to catch up. When he ducked behind the blanket, he saw the men lowering Dak onto a cot. There were other patients on cots nearby. Rick was relieved they'd made it out of the storm to a place where Dak might get help, and only now did he reach down to massage his aching knee. When he brought his fingers back up to his face, he saw blood. The board had cut him. Rick moved toward Dak's cot, nodding to the men who had helped carry Dak as they left. "Who are you, anyway?" Sera was asking the man, looking over Dak's wounds. "I am Jasaw," he said without looking up. "The Aman, medicine man of our village. Your friend is very hurt." "And how do you know how hurt he is?" Sera said. "It's not like you're a real doctor." "What is doctor?" Jasaw said, looking up at her. Rick placed his hand on Sera's arm to try to calm her down. "How bad are his injuries?" he asked Jasaw. The man turned his focus back to Dak and shook his head. He ran his hands lightly over Dak's face and neck, and then left them hovering over his eyes, as if he was trying to read something through his palms. Then he leaned an ear against Dak's chest. "Something has struck your friend on the head, yes?" Rick and Sera both nodded. "He is breathing normally, but I fear his brain may swell, which would be very bad." Rick watched the man grind up several different kinds of herbs, stir them into a liquid that looked like wine, and drip some of the concoction onto Dak's tongue. Then he rubbed his hands together and touched Dak's head and back. "No broken bones," he said. "How do you know?" Sera said. "You don't have an X-ray machine. You don't have anything." "Sera," Rick said. "He's doing the best he can." "I have what I need," Jasaw said. Sera turned to Rick. "We have to get him to a hospital. Now." Rick could see the fear flickering in Sera's eyes. "But Ichik says he's the best," Rick told her. "The best what?" Sera said. "The best mystic?" "Healer." "Dak needs a real doctor," Sera said. "You saw that wall fall on him." Rick rubbed Sera's shoulder. "We can't chance warping out of here with Dak unconscious. You said it yourself. It's getting harder and harder on our bodies. We have to wait until he's stronger." Jasaw was now pushing his hands up Dak's chest toward his face. "What are you doing?" Sera asked him. "Ridding the body of evil spirits," Jasaw said without looking up. Sera shot Rick a desperate look. "I'm staying right here," she said. "All night. I'm making sure he takes care of Dak." Jasaw burned a plant-based incense over Dak's body. The smell was strong. Rick knew Sera didn't believe in anything spiritual like this. She believed in hard science. But this was Dak's only hope. He pictured what happened again. Dak rushing into the middle of the hut, pushing the girl to safety, the wall coming down on the back of his head. Rick leaned in close to Dak's ear and said in a quiet voice that even Sera wouldn't be able to hear. "You saved that girl's life, Dak. You know that? You're a hero." He kept waiting for Dak to open his eyes and say something sarcastic, but he never did. He just lay there, completely still, as Jasaw rubbed dark ash onto his forehead. Rick tried sleeping on the blanket Ichik set out for him, but he was unable to shut off his mind. He kept picturing the stone wall coming down on Dak and the cryptic riddle they'd pulled up on the square. He also thought about his time on the run in 1850. He'd been able to keep a young boy, James, out of the hands of slave traders. Why was he so helpless now? Eventually, he gave up on sleep. He walked quietly over to the cave opening and sat on a boulder to watch the powerful storm. The rain still poured down on the beautiful green Mayan landscape. The wind still whipped through the trees, but the thunder and lightning seemed more distant now, which told Rick the worst of it had passed. Rick had always been intrigued by natural disasters. In an odd way, sometimes he even found himself rooting for storms and earthquakes and tornadoes. It's not that he wanted to see anyone get hurt, and he knew the increased frequency of these disasters was a direct result of the SQ creating breaks in history, the breaks he, Dak, and Sera were busy trying to correct. But he always thought that maybe the right disaster would come along and hit the SQ where it hurt, compromising their political power. Maybe it would be like hitting the reset button on the world. But there was a non-SQ-related reason he was so fascinated by disasters, too. A reason nobody who knew him would ever suspect. Secretly, Rick sometimes wanted to hit the reset button on his own life. For as long as he could remember, he'd worked tirelessly to be the best at everything he did. School, soccer, language acquisition, the art of memory. At first it was fun, and the praise he received made him feel special, but somewhere along the line, things shifted. The fun faded. The pressure to stay on top started weighing down on his shoulders. He put in all those extra hours not because he was enjoying himself, but because he was afraid to fail. Lately, he'd been having an awful recurring nightmare where Brent and Mari followed him around, shaking their heads in disappointment. His classmates spoke in hushed voices about him getting only an A-. Rick was watching the pouring rain, dreaming about living a normal life where he'd sleep in on weekends and hang out at the mall, when he heard footsteps creeping up behind him. He spun around quickly, instinctively popping to his feet. It was Kisa. "Hey," she said, grinning at his military move. "Hey," Rick said back, slowly unclenching his fists. "I can't sleep either." She was holding a small wooden box in her right hand. "I keep thinking about what happened to your friend. I'm really sorry." Rick nodded. "Jasaw is a gifted healer, though. He'll make sure your friend has the best care." "Thanks," Rick said. He searched his mind for something else to say, but he didn't have any experience talking to girls like Kisa, so he sort of just stood there awkwardly, looking at her. "What about you?" she said. "How's your knee?" He furrowed his brow, confused. "How'd you know I hurt my knee?" She switched the wooden box from her right hand to her left. "I saw you limping while you were carrying your friend, and then in the cave you were rubbing it. You should really tell Jasaw what happened." "I'll be okay," Rick said. "It's just a cut." He looked at her for a few long seconds, trying to think of something else to say, something that would keep her out here with him. But his mind felt sluggish, and his stomach had that weird feeling again. "Mind if I sit out here for a bit?" she asked. "Yes," he said, a little too excitedly. "No, don't mind. Yes, you can sit." He felt heat rising into his cheeks and the tips of his ears. Kisa sat on the boulder next to his and set down her wooden box. "What's in there?" Rick asked. "Jewelry," she said. "I figured if I was going to have a sleepless night, I might as well get some work done." Rick watched her remove a small block of wood and a knife and start whittling. "My mother says it's a man's job to make artistic things," she said. "But I know my jewelry's as good as any man's, if not better." She looked up at Rick. "I hate that there are things girls aren't supposed to be good at. Who says?" Kisa pulled a metal piece out of her box and held it up for Rick to see. He took the bracelet and turned it over in his hands. "Wow," he said. It was shaped like a thin, coiled snake. Each scale was meticulously crafted, as were the eyes and tongue. It was as well constructed as any piece of jewelry he'd seen in the modern world. "I'm impressed," he told her, handing back the snake. Kisa smiled and put it away. "Can I ask you something, Rick? I've been wondering about it all night." "Of course," he said. "What's a historian?" He studied her dark brown eyes. During training back home, his supervisors drilled into him the importance of guarding historian intel. Even the daily cafeteria menu was password protected. But Rick was weary from all the time travel, and the storm, and what had happened to Dak. He needed to talk to someone. So he did. He told Kisa about the SQ and Aristotle's theory about the Great Breaks. He explained how the world was thrown off balance every time history had been altered by the SQ, causing strange occurrences all over, far worse than this storm. He told her historians were people stationed throughout time, trained to look out for the time travelers Aristotle predicted would one day show up from the future to try to fix history and save the world. When he finished, Kisa looked at him for a long time before saying, "So, you three really are from the future? Like your friend said?" Rick knew he'd said too much already. He expected this to make him feel tremendously guilty. But it didn't. For whatever reason, he trusted Kisa. "It's okay," she said. "You don't have to answer that." She went back to whittling away at her piece of wood. Rick could now see what she was carving, a snake rising up out of a basket. "Can I ask you a question now, Kisa?" She nodded. "Did you live in the hut that was destroyed?" "No," she said. "But I spent a lot of time there. My Uncle Ichik lived there with his family." "How will he fix it? And where will everyone live in the meantime?" "Someone will take them in," she said. "We all look out for one another in my village." They talked for a while longer, mostly about Kisa's family and her village. Rick was moved by how much they cared for one another, and how much they respected the land. They seemed far different from the way they were presented in history classes, and he was surprised to find out that Ichik was no ordinary man. He was the king of Itzamal. Had been for years. Then they sat together in silence, Kisa whittling and Rick watching the rain soften and the dark slowly lose its grip on the sky. It felt nice sitting beside her without talking. He didn't feel awkward anymore. Eventually, Kisa packed up her things and stood and wished Rick a good night. But she didn't leave right away. She just stood there, watching the quiet rainfall for a few moments. "One day," she finally said, turning to Rick, "I want to do something special too." "I bet you will," he said. She smiled, then turned and walked back into the cave. It wasn't until Kisa was long gone that Rick noticed she'd left the snake bracelet on the boulder where she'd been sitting. He was about to scoop it up and hurry after her, but then he saw the message she'd carved into the rock. He stared at the glyphs for several seconds. He was one of the few historians who could decipher Mayan writing, but it wasn't easy. Eventually, he was able to read, "For my new friend, Rick." He slipped the bracelet onto his wrist, feeling a wave of excitement pass through his body. He lifted the piece of jewelry up to his eyes to study the details of the metallic snake, and then a thought suddenly occurred to him. What if Kisa was the snake charmer from the riddle?